The thing that we totally miss is why. Why did the British come to Australia?
His perspectives on Australian history will blow your mind.
The French, because they're in massive debt after the last war with the British they had, are now getting money from Holland, the Dutch East India Company, that's flowing into France, and they're using the money to build up the French Navy, and it's the French Navy getting built up that's upsetting the British East India Company, who's also, they're huge.
It's 1786. The French are preparing for war. They want a slice of the Asian trade. They've sent Count de la Pérouse with 2 ships into the Pacific with the aim of claiming New Holland, Australia, for France. British East India Company directors are worried. Prime Minister Pitt must act. But sending British warships into the Pacific would not be enough. Creating a military outpost in New Holland would not be enough. International law required a settlement to be established on territory declared to be terra nullius if possession was to be legal. So began the most expensive venture ever undertaken by Britain to establish a settlement on the other side of the earth. Yet it would become Britain's greatest commercial accident, returning 3 times the wealth to Britain than Canada did. So writes my guest this week, and his perspectives on Australian history will blow your mind. Historian Dr. Christopher Reynolds completed his PhD and master's degrees at Claremont, one of America's most prestigious graduate universities, and he's held appointments with both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives and worked under Senators Teddy Kennedy and Mitch McConnell. And he received a commendation from President Ronald Reagan. Last month, he launched his new book, What a Capital Idea, Australia 1770 to 1991. The launch was carried out by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Sydney, and Christopher Reynolds will be speaking at an event in Brisbane on Tuesday night, and he joins me right now. Dr. Reynolds, welcome to The Other Side, and thank you for bringing this incredible monster of a book that you've written, 500 plus pages, and incredible research, uncovering things that we've never heard of before or learned at school in history. What is the most compelling aspect of your findings, do you think, in all the work that you've done?
Oh, but what a question. 500 pages.
If you could just condense it down for 10 seconds for me. But it's the French, right? I mean, the fact that so much...
Yeah, I think the thing that we totally miss is why. Why did the British come to Australia? And we have some, I can only say ridiculous ideas that it was somehow to empty the prisons. But Britain was taking in 5,000 new prisoners per year into its system. Sending 700 convicts out to Australia meant absolutely nothing to the prison system. But also the people that were sent were called transportees. They were not sentenced to incarceration. They could not be locked up.
None of them?
None of them, because they'd been sentenced to be put out of the country to get away from the slums and the trouble that they were living in, to give them a second chance at life. And so they were being sent to 7 or 14 years, which was just a marker, to be cared for, looked after, supervised. So this was, I think, as you've just pointed out, one of the most fundamental things I discovered was that the reason of why these people went on to form a society and how we got the whole concept of what transportation was so wrong.
So it wasn't convicts being sent as criminals to do to a penal colony. So, well, it was a penal colony, but they were sent as transportees who were being given a second chance at life. So there would have been some degree of almost willingness on the part of some of them, at least, I guess, and others perhaps forced. But
yeah. And you're right, when I got into the original legislation to do with felons, and I kept chasing it, I got all the way back to the Elizabethan Act of 1695. That's 300 years ago. The British first wrote their legislation to do with trying to help people find a better life for themselves. And when I got into that act, I could see that nobody had ever bothered to cover it before. Manning Clark and Keneally and even Geoffrey Blainey, whose work I admire, had never bothered. and never were able to find the legislation that actually explained the transportation.
You've just named the three greatest historians or
Yeah.
biggest historians in Australian history,
Yeah, I know.
and not one of them has really
No.
tapped on what you found.
I know, I'm walking all over this stuff. I sent a copy of the book down to Jeffrey Blaney, because I admire his work. And he wrote back and he said, my goodness, he said, the research. He said, you even know how many Bibles Johnson took out with him in the First Fleet. He said, I just can't believe it. And he said, congratulations, he said, and it used an old Irish phrase, your mother would be proud. I asked Jeffrey if he'd actually do the Melbourne launch for me, of the book. He said, well, I'm now 95 and they don't let me out much, so I'm not going to be able to do it for you. But it was great to get a compliment of that ilk from Jeffrey.
Okay, so what you found was that, first of all, the British had this notion of wanting to kind of give people a second start at life, a second chance at life. But they were still hitting people up who were pretty petty criminals, right? I mean, what was the incentive or motive to do that and send them to the other side of the earth?
Yeah, let me give you an example. There was a robbery that involved the family by the name of Henry Cable, the Cable family. Now, the father and his brother decided they're going to knock over this empty house in the north of England, see? So the people are away and they get the youngest son, Henry's youngest son is also Henry, to look after the dray in the street. So they wait for the sun to go down because it's England and the sun's not going down till around 9 o'clock. So I got into all of these details. Then the lights go out and the two elder men go in and raid the house, and young Henry has to keep the horse and the dray quiet around the corner. Well, these guys get into the house and they drink the wine and they throw things all over the place. They load up the cart and they take it 5 miles back to their house, okay? So the owners are in an absolute fit. The neighbours are in a fit. The police don't know what to do. This is just downright un-British, So anyway, I got onto the newspaper reports, and this is 1786 or 85, and I'm reading the newspaper reports on this. Well, they find the Cables that have done it, and the police bang on the door. The fellas inside set fire to the goods to try and destroy it. So there's a fire going on in the house. The constable breaks down the door. Henry bashes the cop on the face. Down he goes. But up he gets, says the newspaper, struggles Henry to the floor and arrests them. They're not on the newspaper. So the old man Henry and his brother, they hang him straight off for theft. The younger fellow, they decide, well, he was driving the dray, so we'll send him to transportation. So he has to wait till the ships are actually leaving, because they got a bit of a problem with the Americans at the time where they could send convicts, etc. So there's this big venture going to Australia and Henry gets picked. The thing about it is that he's now fallen in love with a young woman by the name of Susanna, and they have a child, which creates a great storm of event because the baby's not on the manifest and the captain won't accept her. So the turnkey in charge of the prison runs up to Lord Sydney, gets on his horse, runs up to Lord Sydney, explains the problem. Lord Sydney says, well, where's the father? Put them all on the ship. Well, it makes the newspaper. And so there's a group of people gathered to give them goods to help them in their new life.
Oh, okay. Very different to what we've been told.
Yeah.
And that was First Fleet?
Yes.
Okay.
When Henry comes out, the captain's got into the goods on his ship. And so he complains to the governor, and the governor says, well, see young David Collins here, he's the new Attorney General. And Collins says, well, he's only young too. He says, well, we can't have this. So he holds the first court in Australia, and the Cables win their case, and the ship can't leave until the captain pays him money. Now, two things come out of this. Firstly, that the couple get married in the first few weeks that they're in the country. Cable wins his case, which is the first law case in this country, and the Cable family still exists. They've just had a reunion again in Sydney only a month ago, and I think they still own the Cable restaurant in Sydney.
Wow. Okay.
But that's just, you can hear how different the story is
Very different.
to what you think. And so the Cables went on to, and Cable did something with the police or something.
All right, so there was this impetus or initiative of Britain to kind of, send out the criminals, send out the cases that were probably not too serious, but not serious enough to hang.
Correct.
But not petty enough to kind of ignore, and they wanted to give these people a new start at life to a certain extent. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, and you go into it in the book in a bit more detail, because the US is involved, and then there's all sorts of different things going on around the world at the time. But The French. What's the French connection? This is
Yeah.
the whole idea that there was a real motive for establishing the Australian colony.
I got into where the money was through this guy called Baron James Harris, who puts a plan to Prime Minister Pitt 2 weeks after the fleet has left Britain.
British Prime Minister Pitt. Yep.
Yeah, sorry, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. And they have a secret meeting. And because it's a secret meeting, Sydney's...
What year are we in now?
We're in 1787.
So just before the first fleet. Yep. Right. 1 year before. Okay.
Yeah. So the fleet leaves in May. 2 weeks later, they have a secret meeting. Pitt puts a plan. Harris puts a plan to Pitt, and he says, "I can bring down the French." What's the problem? The French, because they're in massive debt after the last war with the British they had, are now getting money from Holland, the Dutch East India Company, that's flowing into France, and they're using the money to build up the French Navy, and it's the French Navy getting built up that's upsetting the British East India Company, who's also, they're huge. They're writing to Prime Minister Pitt saying, you need to do something.
Right. Okay, so just to summarise,
All right.
you've got the Dutch East India Company funding the French. Okay, the French are building up their navy. The British East India Company is freaking out about what the French are going to do in Asia if they get over there and establish colonies and stuff. Okay, so this creates an impetus for Britain to establish to establish New Holland as a colony of Britain.
Yes.
To do that, they have to have a settlement, right? They can't just say, "Oh, it's ours." You've got to have a settlement.
But it's called New South Wales, because Cook's been there 10 years earlier.
We're not going to give it to the Dutch. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So it's not the Dutch East.
Sorry,
it's not New Holland anymore.
It's still
New South Wales.
Yes.
Bang. You know, once the king says that's it. See, so that's the situation. So where we make the mistake is this business of thinking that it all begins with the convicts on the ship. What nonsense! It doesn't. It begins with there's a genuine financial threat going on. There's money involved, and Harris comes up with a plan, and he says, "I can bring down the French in a matter of months." And Pitt says, well, firstly, two things. How much do you want? He says £70,000 or $14 million. He said it'll be in your bank account by Friday. And the next thing is...
So 14 million in today's money, so £70,000
He's
then.
got the cash and went by ship, and he had it in his pocket in his travel bags, I suppose. Well, where else are you going to put, $14 million? What do you got in the bag, The other thing was that they realised that this needed to remain incredibly secret, because if it got out, if the French heard that the British had actually been funded a plot to bring down France, it would have brought on war. So the four men in the room were dedicated to secrecy. And even after this all falls out and it's finished, it takes the Dutch and the French 4 or 5 or more years to realise that this fellow James Harris, Baron James Harris, the British ambassador to The Hague, who came up with the plan of what he had done. So the plan is so well laid that nobody knows what he's done. He brings down France, and October 27, 1787, remember Philip's arriving January 88, the French have to write a letter, and they say, and the review says, they had been brought to a point of impotence, that they could not defend their own interests in Europe. And the French write and say, we will now see no value in any British or Dutch interests anywhere in the world. So even if this silly theory about La Perouse getting to Australia first and sticking a flag in the sand, which he wasn't going to do anyway, but even if he'd done that, the International Court would have declared it null and void, because France had already said 5 months earlier, we will take no interest in anything that the British are doing. And none of that has ever been published before. For people to know what was really going on.
Amazing. And it's all in here. What a capital idea. Australia 1770 to 1991. I mean, there's a lot more in here as well. We don't have time to get into, Chris, but I'd love to have you back on the show sometime in the future to tell us more about it. You are speaking, importantly, you're speaking in Brisbane on Tuesday night for Voting Matters. And people want to find out more, they can go to the website address that's on the screen at the moment. But Tuesday night, 6:30 in the Brisbane suburb of Tingalpa at the Tingalpa Hotel. You're going to be speaking with another great speaker as well, I believe, but getting into more of this.
Good, thank you very much.
Great to have you. Really hope you enjoyed that content. There's a lot more where that came from, and it's available right here on YouTube. So do check it out. The Other Side with me, Damien Curry, your weekly summary news show, every Friday night dropping at 8 p.m. Also, we have lots of clips that come out during the week, so please subscribe. Press that little bell when you do subscribe. You can subscribe down there, you can subscribe up here, and we also have our full shows right here.